Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Our communication creates our social worlds, and that is to say that it is in our communicating with one another that we build meaning, that we form relationships, that we decide what is true and what we value and what we want. And then the truth behind that statement is that we have choices about how we show up in our communicating with other people. This is one of the things we're going to get into in our conversation today. This is part 2 of our conversation with Karen and Sonja Foss. So if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I'm going to recommend that you go back and do that first. I'll include a link for that in the description. But in this conversation, we're going to get into some connections that Karen and Sonja Foss have discovered between communication and feminism. Some of these connections are how they can work hand in hand, and some of these connections are how they have traditionally been at odds with one another in different ways. I think this is a really insightful conversation, and Karen and Sonja have a lot to share and gave me at least a lot to think about in terms of how I understand communication and its purpose. One question I'd have you keep in mind during this conversation is, how can you move away from a kind of communication that is persuasive and dominating, and instead create a kind of communication that is inviting and understanding? So with that in mind, let's jump right in.
It's great to be able to hear the language that you use and then to see the parallels in my own study, or especially specifically in CMM. Like, you are speaking that theory so clearly of the communication creates the social worlds, and boiling it down, it's about this choice that we have about how we're approaching that communication. What kind of social world do we want? We actually get to choose that. And yeah. I see a parallel that I think is especially striking to me as you using this process of understanding, critiquing, and transforming, is that in a earlier conversation I recorded with someone who did a fellowship at the CMM Institute, Alex Jagiello, she used this great language that I loved of kind of a parallel process using the language of imagination, genuine inquiry, and embodiment. And I see those as kind of running parallel to each other on maybe one is more on a personal level and the other is on a societal level about how we're, I don't know if you would call that a change strategy, but how we're going about change. It fits into the whole conversation you're having. And that's really striking to me. And yeah, there's so much nuance in the conversation around feminisms, plural specifically. I think that's a great nuance to even start with. But what I appreciated about what you've just talked about, and in the first pages of your book, you said, when it really comes down to it, feminism is about choice. And I think that is such a strong core foundation of it that's so important from my perspective. And so I love that that's how you were able to talk about it and always come back to that root in everything that you were writing. And
no, I think if you had to boil down feminism to one word, choice is a pretty good one.
Yeah, if we had to, yeah.
And one of the major values behind feminism is the self-determination, that everybody gets to choose how they want to do their lives. So yes, I think choice is a good one.
Yeah.
So, and I think, we've already mentioned equality, which I think is still has to be in there as a feminist value too, along with choice and self-determination. And I also think another one is immanent value, where the sense that you're okay however you are, and we need to just acknowledge that as a kind of running around the world trying to change people or make them be different. So
yeah, it's so compelling to me, the idea that feminism is better for everybody.
Yes,
because it is, everybody has their innate worth, whatever type of woman you are, way that you are a woman, or however anyone identifies, is just eminent value, not to be obtained by being any specific way or taking any kind of action. Is an important core of it in my eyes, for sure.
And so I think we would say because these different values are operating as central to feminism, when you bring those into communication, different things are going to happen as well. We talked about the importance of when we realized that we couldn't just add the women and stir, it does fundamentally change things. So we'd like to talk about 3 different connections that we see between feminism and communication, or how communication rooted in these feminist values is going to look quite different. So the first one is that what counts as important communication is going to change. And this is probably quite obvious from what we've already said, but instead of valuing only the talk of great white dead men, you're going to value women in whatever forms of expression they have, or people in whatever forms of expression they have. Sonja mentioned Women Speak, where we cataloged women quilting, shopping, gardening, writing letters, planning kids' birthday parties, whatever it is. What was most interesting about that book, or not most interesting, but an interesting fact, was we realized that many of these women had jobs out in the real world, financial planner. One woman cleaned houses, but they would come home and they would do what they loved. So women were still having to make a choice between working and then expressing themselves in the way that mattered most. But the important thing is that we're starting to recognize the importance of those forms of expression and trying to give them some legitimacy. Yes. I think a second way that communication intersects with and changes communication is that it suggests we don't always have to be trying to persuade other people when we communicate. Communication doesn't always have to be designed to gain power, or to get our perspective to prevail, or to get someone to acquiesce to us. Now, in the communication discipline, the words rhetoric, and rhetoric is just an old word for communication, but rhetoric or communication has always been defined as persuasion. Going back to Aristotle in the 5th century BC, we've always seen communication and persuasion as synonymous terms. And persuasion is so widely used and accepted that most of us have never stopped to question it as an appropriate project, or to think, well, there might be a form of communication that doesn't involve persuasion. So there are a couple of problems from a feminist perspective with this effort to persuade, with why we don't like that definition of communication. One is that implicit in persuasion is often a desire for control and domination. The act of changing someone establishes our power over that person. So if you tell a friend, oh, they should listen to this podcast, it's really good, I think you'd like it. You have, if only for a few minutes, influenced that person's life. If they listen to the podcast, certainly, but even if they just think about listening to it. And what's interesting to us is how often we try to get other people to do what we want, even when what that thing is has absolutely no impact on our own lives. Whether your friend listens to the podcast or not is totally irrelevant. But I think the reason we work so hard to get other people to change is because it makes us feel good. It makes us feel like we've got self-worth, we've got some kind of power. So that's one problem with persuasion from a feminist perspective. The effort to gain control over others is really at the heart of persuasion. And there's another problem with persuasion too, and we sort of alluded to this earlier. It devalues the lives and perspectives of the people you're trying to change. So when we're trying to change others, in essence, we're saying to them, the belief systems and behaviors that you have created for living in the world are inadequate or inappropriate, and they have to be changed. So it's a very paternalistic attitude. We're essentially saying, oh, let me help you, let me enlighten you, let me show you the way. And so persuasion really constitutes a kind of trespassing on the personal integrity of someone else. You could even see persuasion as an act of violence. You're violating the integrity of someone else. We aren't allowing them to make choices about how they want to live their lives. Plus, it's really hard to change someone else. I don't know if you've tried recently. Doesn't usually work. Think about if someone comes up to you and says, oh, you should take yoga, or you should change your voter registration to become a Democrat, or you should become a vegan. most of us don't immediately say, oh, I think that's a great idea. I'll go sign up for a yoga class this afternoon. No, we usually get defensive. We cling to our old habits and our beliefs even more strongly than we did before. One of our favorite feminist theorists, Sonja K, talked about how she realized how difficult it is to change other people when she thought about how she tried to change her 4 children. And I'm just going to give her a quote. She said, I had these 4 human beings on the planet who had come right out of my womb. I had created them. They were partly me, and we adored each other. We loved each other. We respected each other. And I remember how I had never been able to make them do what I wanted from the moment they were born. They really wanted to because they loved me. They tried very hard, but they really couldn't do their lives the way I wanted them to. And so then she came to the conclusion, well, if this were the case, how could she expect people she didn't even know, like legislators and judges and Supreme Court justices and bishops, to change to please her? So there are all these problems then with persuasion, which is how communication has been defined. And so I think you're probably beginning to see how the standard ways of doing communication violate our commitment to feminism. So feminism is telling us create ways of being and acting that don't dominate others, but the communication discipline and how we're taught to communicate is telling us to do exactly that, to use communication to try to get other people to change. In other words, to dominate them. So I wasn't the only one who was struggling with this. One of my master's students, Cindy Griffin, she was also trying to reconcile her feminism with communication. And so that led us to theorize a new kind of communication based on feminist values that does not involve persuasion. And we came to call this new form of communication invitational rhetoric. I remember rhetoric is just an old word for communication, so you can think of it as invitational communication. And we defined invitational rhetoric as an invitation to understanding as a means to create a relationship rooted in equality, immanent value, and self-determination. So invitational rhetoric really constitutes an invitation to the audience to enter the communicator's world, to see it as the communicator does. And invitational communicators simply present their perspectives. They don't advocate for those perspectives. They simply say, this is how the world looks to me. And then hopefully the audience will accept the invitation that's being offered, and they will share their perspectives, again, without trying to persuade, so that there's this exchange where everybody contributes their perspectives, learns more about an issue, and because of this non-hierarchical, non-adversarial framework that's established for the interaction, the participants also come to understand one another better. So that's one of the basic forms that we've come up with, where feminism and feminist values really led us to create a new kind of communication. And I do want to be clear that we're not saying you should never, ever use persuasion, that you should always use invitational rhetoric. There are many times when persuasion is the perfect choice. Get someone to accept a proposal in order to be seen as effective, for example, or in times of crisis, when time is short, you've got to make a decision and get people to do something together. Persuasion's a great choice. But there are other situations when changing and controlling other people isn't our goal, or it doesn't have to be the goal. So with the identification of invitational rhetoric, we can recognize situations where we don't need to persuade. Instead, we want to create an environment where we're trying to understand something or someone, where you're according value and respect to other people's perspectives, and where you're trying to develop relationships of equality. So we think invitational rhetoric, a form of communication based on these feminist values, is a useful option for all of us to have in our rhetorical toolbox.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to finish off with our third connection that we see between feminism and communication. And it follows nicely from what Sonja was just talking about, because she was talking about a mode of communication that doesn't involve trying to change someone. But there's also, sometimes you do want things to change, and can we conceptualize an approach that might work that way, that comes from feminist values as well? Well, as a result of thinking about feminism and communication for a long time, we finally had to lay out the conventional persuasion paradigm. Then we tried to lay out the feminist one, both of which make use of our communication backgrounds as well. But they do give you insight, I think, into how things have been traditionally thought about, how they change with feminism, but how you can do change in a kind of a feminist mode as well. In this conventional paradigm, which we call constricted potentiality, the communicators are focusing on the material features of the world. So you're looking at tangible things, people, places, systems, organizations, structures that you want to change. And the interesting thing is that these components are limited because they're in tangible form. So you only have that amount of things to work with. They can be depleted, they can go away, whatever. And persuasion is the strategy that you are trying to use to either get people who have power to change the laws, to change the structures, to change the rules, or you are trying to get other people to come to share your vision of the world, like to join you in taking a yoga class or whatever it is. But the focus on all of this is external. You're wanting to change the material conditions out in the world, the people, the places, the systems. And you're limited because you're only working with these resources that are out there. So the alternative paradigm, what we call constructed potentiality, and you'll see the social construction of reality stuff coming back in here. If you're committed to self-determination, immanent value, it doesn't feel right to go running around the world making people change. And so this takes seriously that the resources that you have to work with are really symbolic resources. They're your symbols, your spoken, written, and visual symbols, your thoughts, your interpretations. And these are all invented by the communicators. So from the very beginning, you can see a real difference. You're not just tackling material conditions out in the world. You're working with things that you have under your control and within you, the symbols. And interpretation is the basic core of this. We talked about choice before. I mean, however you want to label it. Mm-hmm. But this is the process by which you assign meaning to things around you. So we're always interpreting things. We can't help it. And you can make a deliberate choice about how to interpret. You can interpret what to perceive, what to pay attention to. You can make a choice about how to interpret that perception, how to label that perception. So there's no end to the different interpretations possible. Another option is always available because it's all invented. So the fact that I can create one interpretation means I can create another one, and I can create another one that works better for the social world I'm wanting to live in. So in contrast to trying to persuade people in the outside world and work with those resources, in this paradigm, you're really changing yourself. The interpretation is directed internally. So we choose an interpretation that makes us move closer to the state of well-being or contentment or ease for us, no matter what the conditions are in the external world. So we're essentially taking responsibility for our own well-being, for the world that we're creating. So many people would stop and say, well, then how is the world going to change? This, you're changing yourself and you're still sitting there like, in some yoga pose or something. What good does that do? Well, first of all, what often happens is if you change your interpretation, you can see something as less of a problem, for example. It's not as big of a deal as it used to be because I'm choosing not to make it a big deal. We came across a story where a man had signed up for a class in meditation because he said he had severe pain in his feet. And the first day of class, he said, the pain is so bad he wanted to cut off his feet. But by the end of the meditation program, he said, the pain hasn't changed much, but my attitude toward the pain has changed a lot, and my feet are less of a problem.
Mm.
So that's one of the ways that I think change happens in the world. A second way that changing yourself can affect external conditions is that you often open up opportunities for discovering resources that you didn't pay attention to because you were so locked into this, oh, this is such a traumatic experience, I have to sit here and, tell you all about it, instead of saying, oh, this might be an interesting adventure or an interesting opportunity. And then suddenly you're connecting up with people and other things that might give you some new solutions that you hadn't thought about. And I think the whole asset-based community development movement, if you've heard of that, it's a movement that's designed to change conditions in like cities that seem really problematic, abandoned buildings, vacant lots. They take advantage of the people who are there, teenagers, disabled people, professionals, anybody that's living in the community, and they take the problematic things and turn them into assets. So you turn that abandoned building into the teen center with the help of the teenagers who've been hanging out in the neighborhood causing problems, so you flip things around. But also changing yourself has been found to literally affect physical reality. So we know that athletes, if they mentally rehearse, like going down a particular ski slope during the Olympics, that can be just as effective for refining timing and patterns as actually going down that ski slope. Or they found, for example, that a placebo for Parkinson's altered the firing patterns in the brain just as the actual drug does, as long as you think it does. Another study showed that people who believe they are poor have dramatically higher disease risks and shorter lifespans than people with the same resources who don't see themselves as poor. So, a lot of interesting studies have shown that there is much more of an impact than we normally might think. So I hope this gives you some sense of how communication for us as effective feminism, but more importantly, going the other direction.
A feminist approach to communication, the way I'd conceptualize it based on what you're saying, is that it's communicating to be understood and to understand, and communicating to be heard and to hear others, as opposed to maybe the traditional communicating to persuade, to control, to dominate. That seems like that's in very direct opposition with how we've understood communication, like you're saying, for a long time, which is why it's not as effective to say, okay, let's get women into these existing theories and systems and understandings. Is that, no, we need to get some new understandings. And yeah, I think that's really, really valuable. And then the other thing I was thinking about is, when I care about something, I really, really care about it, and I get really excited about it, and I want other people to be as excited about it as I am. And I've really found that you could put a lot of energy into trying to persuade someone to care just as much as you do about something, and all you're going to end up with is less energy than you had before. I've appreciated hearing your experience today of where you've gotten to where you are, but that doesn't give me the experience you've had. I can't fully appreciate it in the same way. And so I think what I've learned, the conclusion I've come to, is that the best way to, I guess, persuade other people is to just care and care and care and care for myself. And I think that's a very vulnerable thing, especially for young people. It's kind of like, if you're saying you're caring about something, that's not cool. Cool is like, I don't care about anything, because it's a vulnerable thing to say, I care about this thing, I'm invested in this thing. If something happened to this thing, I would be upset. But I think maybe that is like an ethical version of persuasion, is to go all in on your own love or passion for something, and to let that model for other people or be an example to other people, to be able to say, oh, I want what she has. She has good energy over there. She's got this passion, this energy that's, radiating out of her. That's, not that anyone said that about me, but that would be a huge compliment. But I think that's maybe a goal of finding that kind of ethical way to persuade.
But your passion for CMM is a perfect example.
Yeah, well, that's very kind.
I think we also should admit that I think everybody, when you get involved in kind of a cause or something you really like, you do go try to change other people because you want them to come around.
Yeah.
So we often talk about when we were feminists in the beginning, we were feminist bullies. We admit it. You shouldn't change your name when you get married. You should do this. You should, and I think now we cringe.
Mm-hmm.
but I think that's a common kind of impulse, I think, when you get excited and you want to share your excitement. Yeah.
I think it's a good just distinction to make between, because someone could say, your book is all about change strategies. Couldn't you say, like, isn't that just persuasion? But there's a really important distinction there.
And there are some strategies in the book that are traditional persuasion.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I think it's different to approach them in terms of having that layer of seeking to be communicating, to be understood and to hear and to be heard, and instead of just blanket control, dominate kind of change.
Okay, that is all for part 2 of our conversation with Karen and Sonja Foss, but we will be back next week with part 3, where we're going to wrap up this conversation. It'll just be a short episode. One of the things that I'm going to keep thinking about after this conversation, and I imagine might stick with you as well, is the importance of those 3 facets of feminist value, being equality, immanent value, and self-determination. I wonder if those are concepts that you've ever really thought about before. I haven't really thought about them. Equality, yes, but not the other 2 really, and certainly not all together in relationship with one another. So I think that's something interesting to keep thinking about until we meet again in next week's episode. As always, I get to do this podcast with support from the CMM Institute. It's not an overstatement to say some of the greatest people that I've had the pleasure of working with, and I'm excited to be taking on some more responsibilities and being more involved in the other initiatives, so I'm excited to share more of those with you as well. The music for this podcast is created by Rick Spann, who's also a member of the CMM Institute and is kind enough to share his music with us. So a huge thank you to Rick. And I'd like to end with some next turns. Of course, in our CMM-ish way of looking at the world, we're always looking for what's our next turn, answering the question, where can we go from here? How can we keep building on what we've created and what we've communicated? So some good podcast next turns, at least, are to follow the show if you haven't done that already. Leave a rating, leave a review, share this episode with a friend, all incredibly helpful things for just growing our community here. I'd also love for you to connect with me. This podcast is my way of getting to talk to you, and there's a couple different mediums that you can use to talk back to me. One is Instagram. You can find me at Stories Live Stories Told Pod. You can also find me on YouTube and comment on any of the videos at Stories Live Stories Told, or you can contact me through the website storieslivestorietold.com. I'd love to hear from you, love to hear your ideas, and keep this conversation alive. Thank you for showing up, thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Live Stories Told. Bye.